Hello, U.S. history students, and welcome to this week's module. We are still in industrialization, and we've got 3 lessons this week, one on working conditions, one on strikes and unions, and one on how industrialization is affecting African Americans and women. So we're going to start this week by talking about working conditions. Now, in previous lessons, we mentioned immigrants coming over and the fact that immigrants were willing to work in dangerous conditions for low pay. We talked last week about monopolies and how monopolies take advantage of both consumers and workers. They take advantage of workers because they lower wages. Sometimes there's a promise to raise wages once the company starts making money, but very rarely is that promise kept. And I know you've talked about this in other history classes, but just to jog your memory, we've talked about the dangerous conditions. We've talked about the low pay. There's long hours. Some people are working 10 to 12 hours a day in factory jobs. There's very few breaks. Children are being hired. Women are being hired. And the reason that companies tend to hire women and children is because they pay them less than men. Women were seen to work less than men. Children were seen to work less than adults. So children and women were often hired, but then paid less. With those dangerous conditions, people are getting hurt, especially kids. Kids are getting caught up in big machines and they're losing arms and legs and hands. And because they're working, they're not in school. And I know school is difficult sometimes, but if everybody's working and nobody's in school and their education is not going to increase, what is that going to do down the road to your country if you can't pass on education to the next generation? Okay. So there are all these bad things going on in factories associated with industrialization at this time. And these poor working conditions are going to lead to labor unions. Okay. And that's where we're headed in our next lesson. Okay. A labor union is an association of workers that simply want better conditions. They want better conditions for themselves and they want better conditions for customers as well. Now, I think labor unions are very important. I think labor unions are good because they protect the workers and they protect us as customers. They have a couple of tools in their belt that they can use to get these better conditions. For example, one of the things that a union can call for is a strike. A strike is when the workers refuse to work unless the owners improve conditions. Okay, so everybody stops working. Sometimes you see this in real life, in real time. You stop working, you see workers outside picketing. They're marching in front of the building. They have signs, but they're protesting until conditions are improved. All right. Now, sometimes strikes are not successful. Sometimes the owner says, "Okay, that's it. You guys don't want to work. I can find other people that are willing to work for less pay and in dangerous conditions, and I'll just hire them." Okay. Sometimes when that happens, the strike is broken. There's enough of the current workers that are like, we don't want to lose our jobs. So they end up going back and working for the owners in the bad conditions. Okay. So sometimes strikes don't work. The hope, though, is you will put pressure on the owner and maybe garner some support from the community. And that will lead to something that we call collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is when workers and owners meet to discuss conditions. Okay, that's what collective bargaining is. So the hope is that the strike will bring the owners and the workers to the table and that everybody will sit down and discuss how to improve conditions. Okay, now when you discuss, you got to be willing to compromise. Okay, the workers have to give up something, the owners have to give up something. And that's the beauty of being able to sit down and talk things out. Now, what are these conditions that workers want to change? Okay, well, number one, they want a shorter work day. No more of these 10 to 12-hour days with very few breaks. Okay, sometimes you'd only get a half hour for lunch. All right, and that did not include dinner or breakfast or anything like that. You got to the factory early in the morning and you stayed until late into the evening. Okay, so we want shorter work days and more breaks. Number two, we want better pay. And by better pay, what we're talking about is a minimum wage. Okay. You are guaranteed to make this amount for the work that you put in. And we want that minimum wage to be livable. Okay. You want to be able to live off minimum wage. I know there's a lot of discussion about minimum wage in the news today. I definitely am in favor of a livable minimum wage, but you got to be careful. If we start pushing up the minimum wage, other things are going to go up too. Okay, so you got to balance the minimum wage and the livable conditions. Okay. Number three, we simply want safer conditions. We want workplace safety laws. If somebody gets injured, they need to leave. Okay, they need to be treated. Hopefully, you put workplace safety laws in place so that nobody gets injured at work in the first place. All right. But we want safer conditions. Not only is that going to benefit the workers, it's also going to benefit consumers as well. And we're going to talk about something in a couple of weeks called The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, which is an expose on the meatpacking industry. There was some serious nasty things going on in the meatpacking industry, and consumers were basically being fed rancid meat. And workplace safety laws is going to prevent that. So workplace safety laws are good for everybody. No more child labor. All right. No more hiring 5-year-olds and 6-year-olds. All right. They need to have a childhood. They need to grow up. They need to be educated. So with child labor laws comes, if we're not going to send them to work, let's send them to school, because an educated population is good for everybody. And then women's suffrage and rights. As more and more women are entering the workforce and they're leaving home, they're becoming exposed to politics, and they want their rights as citizens. If they're good enough to work, then they're good enough to have the same rights that everybody else enjoys as a citizen. All right. And the last two, the child labor laws and the women's suffrage and rights, is in direct opposition. The whole reason that women and children were often hired, like I said, is because the companies were trying to save money because they paid the children and the women less. All right. And we want to prevent that. We want to get rid of child labor altogether, and we want to make sure that women are earning the same as men. Okay. So these are the improvements that these unions are facing, okay, are fighting for. All right. Now, real quick, let's just review the definitions, the terms and definitions. A labor union is simply an association of workers, and you form a union because you want better conditions. You want better conditions for yourself and for consumers. One of the tools that labor unions have under their belts, strikes. Okay, a strike is a work stoppage when everybody agrees to stop until conditions are improved or until conditions are changed. Sometimes the strikes are successful, sometimes they're not. What we hope is that the strikes are going to lead to collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is when the workers and the owners sit down together to discuss conditions. The key to collective bargaining is you have to be willing to compromise. Both sides have to be willing to give and take. But the hope is that conditions will be improved and everybody will go back to work and things will pick up as normal as possible. And then what are those changes that unions are looking for? Shorter work days, better wages, minimum wage laws, safer conditions, no more child labor, and then women are fighting for more suffrage and more rights. And remember, suffrage is the right to vote. Okay, suffrage is the right to vote. So that was a real quick overview of what the conditions are like in factories, how that leads to unions, what unions can do to change conditions, and what conditions they are looking for. Okay, what better conditions they're looking for and fighting for. Where you're headed in the next lesson, we are going to talk about 3 important unions and 3 important strikes. And we'll go into some detail and tell some stories about those strikes and about those unions. So that's where we're headed in our next lesson.